Good evening, folks. Thanks for joining us early. We'll get this show started at 7 or close to it. Really appreciate you all being here. Let's see here. I actually have some pre-webinar polls that I'm going to launch, which we're interested in a few things. So if you see that on your screen now, feel free to vote. Firstly, interested in how you heard about the webinar. Maybe you're a member or get our world famous New Hampshire Audubon e-newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks. There's so much great information in there, including upcoming events, progress on our projects, and ways to get involved with New Hampshire Audubon and our partners. And the other question is, are you a member of New Hampshire Audubon? And for those of you who are, we really appreciate and want to thank you for your support. And if you're not, we invite you to become a part of our conservation family. We are a membership-driven organization that relies on your membership and donors and grants to achieve our charitable mission. We've been really impressed that about 2/3 of the attendees to this huge webinar series are not yet members of New Hampshire Audubon. So thanks for going out on a limb and seeing what we do and hearing from our partners like Dr. Maria Sanders. And again, thanks to those of you just joining us and those of you who have already answered our 2 simple poll questions. If you just joined us, we're interested in how you got to where you are tonight with us in preparation for this webinar. And if you are a member of New Hampshire Audubon, so thank you for being here. Where is the trail that is pictured on the slide? That is a great question. I will stall and see if Diane can fill me in, but this is our raptor biologist, Chris Martin. I believe this was taken in 2017 or 2018 as he was searching for pipits, American pipits. And American pipits only breed in the high elevation of the presidential range. So that's about as good an answer as I can give. It's somewhere in the presidential. If you recognize this place, feel free to raise your hand as the attendee and we'll unmute you and you can tell me where this photo is taken. Great question, thank you. and I stalled long enough, and Diane couldn't bail me out.
That sounded good to me, Mark. It's definitely in the presidential range.
Somewhere. I want to go there. Looks cool. All right. We are going to push this to Facebook Live and get started. Oh, and here are the results of the polls in case you're interested. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Nutter, the Conservation Programs Director here at New Hampshire Audubon. Thanks for being here. I'd first like to acknowledge that this presentation is streaming to you from our state headquarters in Concord, New Hampshire, which is located within the site of the ancient village of Pennacook in Nadakina, which is the traditional ancestral homeland and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. I would like to acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and our ancestors, the Alnambak, or human beings, who have stewarded Nadakina throughout the generations for thousands of years. New Hampshire Audubon is honored to continue the stewardship of these lands, providing opportunities for all people to form connections to the natural world. I invite you to learn more about the Indigenous presence on the land you occupy by visiting the website native-land.ca. Here, you can explore and click on the territories of Indigenous peoples and get connected to resources to learn more. And for a more in-depth understanding of the Granite State, check out all the educational resources available at indigenousnh.com, including this interactive story map that details the Indigenous presence and their stories here in New Hampshire. Thank you for your interest in tonight's topic, Poetry, Place, and Peace of Mind by Dr. Maria Sanders, Professor of Philosophy at Plymouth State University and our humanities expert for this series. I'm looking forward to learning a ton alongside you this evening. And as you may know, this talk is the 13th session of a year-long webinar series called Exploring Connections to and Stewardship of the Natural World, supported through a New Hampshire Humanities Council grant. The past recordings of these excellent talks can be found on the New Hampshire Audubon YouTube page, which are also linked on the series webpage on newhampshire.nhaudubon.org. Throughout this series, we are exploring the intersection of the sciences and the humanities, finding and foraging new ways to connect with nature and learn about the importance of conservation action. So I want to invite you to really take the time and space to consider how tonight's topic and your interest informs, strengthens, or otherwise supports how you define yourself as a person and how you connect with other human communities as well as the wild ones. I implore you to reflect on why this topic and other nature topics are important to you and your personal value system, and how you can connect with others through the topic in your daily life. And before I hand it over to Maria for tonight's presentation, I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly describe how this webinar fits into the larger mission of New Hampshire Audubon. For those of you who don't know, New Hampshire Audubon is a state-based environmental nonprofit organization that's completely independent from National Audubon. We rely on members and donors like you to support our charitable mission, which has 4 programmatic pillars: connecting people to nature through environmental education experiences like school programs, nature day camp, and webinars like these, researching and conserving species in peril, including large raptors and small birds, managing about 10,000 acres of wildlife sanctuaries throughout the state for habitat and recreation, and finally, advocating for sound environmental policy in the New Hampshire State Legislature. I'm able to be here today because of donors and members like you. We also rely on a huge network of volunteers that assist us with wildlife monitoring, ambassador animal care, environmental education, and wildlife sanctuary management throughout the state. If you're a volunteer, member, or supporter of New Hampshire Audubon, I'd like to sincerely thank you. We simply couldn't achieve our mission without you. And if you'd like to become a part of our conservation family today, which I hope you will, please check our website for ways to get involved. So we do have over 46 people registered for this evening's talk, so you'll see that we're in full webinar mode here in Zoom. That said, feel free to use the chat for any thoughts, comments, and reactions you might have, and reserve the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen for any questions that you would like answered by Maria. It's been great to see the vast geographies we've been able to reach through these webinars. So just for fun, try typing into the chat where you're watching this presentation from. And so that others may engage with you, simply change where you're sending your chat message to either it says all panelists and attendees or just the word everyone. Who knows? You might just see your neighbor this evening at the top. I want to give a quick shout out to Diane DeLuca, who is the senior biologist responsible for orchestrating the series. Without her leadership and coordination, this webinar series, which by the way is the largest event series that I've ever been a part of, just simply wouldn't happen. So thank you so much, Diane. Diane and I will be monitoring both the Q&A here in Zoom as well as on Facebook Live, and we'll take questions throughout the presentation. And I've also set the parameters of the Q&A so that other attendees can see your question and like upvote it or comment on it to make sure that that question is answered. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Diane to introduce this evening's presenter.
Thanks, Mark. We're excited tonight to have Dr. Maria Sanders with us. She has been instrumental in helping us put together this series as well. She's our humanities expert. And Dr. Sanders is a philosophy professor at Plymouth State University and a licensed attorney, has dedicated 3 decades to researching scientific variables for living full and flourishing lives, including the development of resilience and the exploration of how spaces become meaningful places. During the fall of 2019, Dr. Sanders traveled for 5 months to all 50 states in the United States, filming interviews that documented people's experiences with place. As a public philosopher, she has written blogs, curated art exhibitions, hosted radio and television shows, and taught philosophy at the college level for over 30 years. Dr. Sanders' philosophy holds that intentionally selecting, creating, and protecting the physical environments within which we feel a natural affinity is essential for living a full and flourishing life. The places where we live, work, and spend our leisure must be a good fit for our health and well-being if we are to thrive to our existence. Just as the farmer cares about the soil, water, and air around their crops in order to maximize excellent growth of those crops, caring about our natural environments provides an essential place for our physical, mental, and spiritual growth and well-being. And tonight, Dr. Sanders will be sharing a presentation entitled Poetry, Place, and Peace of Mind. Thanks, Maria.
Well, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen quickly here. Give me one sec. There we go. All right, well, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. I know you had a lot of options on how to spend your evening, so we're really pleased you decided to spend it with us. Tonight's talk is really going to be partially a talk, but we really want to hear from you as well. So I'd like to have a discussion portion of this as well, because I think it's a topic that not only is so relevant to all of us when it comes to the issue of place, and in particular natural places, is what we'll be focusing on tonight, what nature has to teach us and how poetry can be used as a means for not only exploring nature, but learning more about ourselves through nature. But it's also timely in the sense of what we're all still dealing with this global pandemic and what COVID-19 has brought to the lives of all of us around the world. So let's go ahead and start with what I would, I'm going to move this over a little bit here. I'm going to start with just a little bit of a background on what brought me to writing the book Sunrise Sunset. And this is just a small collection of poetry that was written during the initial lockdown when COVID first spread to the United States. And I, as many of us, were scrambling to make sense of a world that was literally turned on its head. I had the benefit, I would consider to be a double benefit, of having just traveled to all 50 states in the United States. So being forced to quarantine to our home for several months was a little easier than perhaps it would have been if I hadn't had that trip right before COVID hit. But also my son and I were literally quarantined in the middle of a forest. We live in a cabin on Mount Moosilauke in Warren, New Hampshire. And so I'm literally surrounded by trees. We're literally in the heart of the mountains. So nature was all around us as we were trying to make sense of what was going on in the world. And that's where this book, Sunrise Sunset, really came into existence for me. It was as I explored different philosophical ways of reflecting upon not just our society and our schools, our businesses, our places of work, and how everything was changing literally on a day-to-day basis. I was also trying to find a way to express the thoughts that as a philosopher, those reflections were leading to. And it shouldn't be surprising in hindsight, but poetry ended up being the ideal medium. Poetry is important in so many different ways because it really allows us to understand and appreciate nature, but also to explore and discover things about ourselves through nature. So that's why I really firmly believe that all the world is a classroom for us. I know Shakespeare viewed it as a stage. I've always viewed nature and the world around us really as a classroom, whereby wildlife and all of nature as a whole tends to be the teacher in that classroom. So tonight's talk, I'll share a couple poems with you, but for the most part, what we'll be focusing on is research on how nature tends to lead to positive mental outcomes, as well as how poetry itself is an ideal medium for, again, peace of mind and positive mental health. So with that background, let's go ahead and start with a poem. This one is entitled "The Oak Grows On." It's an acrostic poem. For those that have a background in poetry, I'll apologize in advance because I do want to explain some basics about poetry for those that may not be as familiar with poetry as a medium. But acrostic poems are ones that tend to use a word, sometimes a phrase, and the poem is built around that word or phrase. And as you'll see in this poem, the line of each of the separate stanzas of the poem begins with a letter that spells out the key word that this poem was built around. And that word is grit. So this is really a poem about resilience and what nature has to teach us when it comes to persistence and resilience. So the oak grows on. Green leaves bask in the morning sun, catching dew spring's begun. Cherry blossoms dawning hope, sun-sweet kiss strives to cope. Beech and birch spread their limbs, fitting form by wit and whims. Many seasons here and gone, through gain and loss, the oak grows on. Rain pours down as the willow weeps, fallen leaves pile in heaps. Sometimes mild, sometimes harsh, breeze blows through the open marsh. Seedlings rush to maturity, turning obstacles to opportunity. Some trunks split, lines are drawn, pruning dreams, the oak grows on. Ice coats the crown, slowing the maple's juice. Snow flurries down, cradled by the spruce. Pathway extends as rivers run numb. Anticipation frozen, frustration has come. Flowers and ferns wither and die. Evergreen seedlings continue to try. The forest slumbers, waiting for dawn. Icicles exhale, the oak grows on. Tornado arrives unannounced. Tranquility uprooted, buckled and bounced. A funnel of acorns tossed to and fro, spinning upwards find their flow. Resistance surrenders in twisters thrust, scattered and sown by storm's great gust. Nature's invite past the baton, chaos settles and the oak grows on. And I know we're all looking for that day when the chaos of COVID does settle for us as well. But I would like to take just a pause, a moment here. And if you'll use your chat, and again, double check that your chat is set for everyone so that we can all see the responses. But if you'll put in the chat when you think about nature, and all the various things that we can learn about persistency, resilience, grit, that carrying on from nature and wildlife. Share your favorite example of resilience or grit from your natural experiences. And again, if you'll just put those in the chat so that everyone can see. And I'm going to lean on Mark and Diane to read those out because I can't see the chat when I'm sharing screen.
Sure thing, and I also welcome the folks tuning in on Facebook Live to write their reflections there in the chat, and I will let you know if we see anything there as well.
Okay, and as everyone's filling those in, I will talk just real briefly about the impact of nature on well-being, and then we're going to go back and see what those experiences on resilience that we get in the chat. So starting with looking at nature, and then we'll take a more focused look at poetry itself. But nature, as we think about the various cultures around the world, the uniqueness of individuals around the world, something that's always surprising is even for individuals who may not be drawn to spending a lot of time outdoors, the research is showing that an overwhelming majority of people do find a calmness or a kind of a mental benefit, positive benefit from either actual nature, being out in nature, being outdoors, or from scenes of nature. So we're finding that some of the impact for individuals who may not actually want to be outdoors, that they are maybe hypersensitive to the bugs or to the weather elements, the climate elements, they still seem to receive benefits when they're looking at photographs or paintings of natural elements, whether it's trees or sunsets or oceans. So there does seem to be this affinity between obviously human beings and our natural surroundings, which again, within philosophy, we tend to look at this a little more broadly. If you think of the what traditionally has been more of an Eastern view versus a Western view, when it comes to nature. This is all starting to blur into one central view now that travel has become so much simpler over the years. But traditionally, what was thought of philosophically when we talked about nature and environment as a more Western view was a more anthropocentric view, a view that put the human being in like a heightened position. It was center to all of nature. Whereas the more Eastern view, human beings were just one part or one aspect of nature, but they weren't necessarily a more important aspect. And when I say Western and Eastern, those were pretty clumsy lines being drawn. It, to a large extent, was geographic, but not entirely. We definitely had groups of people and cultures that were geographically living in the West, but had adopted more of what philosophically was being classified as an Eastern view. A lot of your Native American tribes, in fact, all of them would fit in that category, where they had more of this balanced outlook when it came to nature. And it was really more of a European notion that placed the human being at this heightened position of power. But even with both sides of this, both aspects, philosophically speaking, what we are seeing is that our environments and the places that we move through our lives in have a direct impact on our physical as well as our mental and spiritual well-being. They can improve it or deteriorate it. So if we're in very noisy, chaotic environments, we tend to have direct physical and mental responses to that. In fact, place directly impacts stress. That's one of the areas that has been heavily researched. In other words, what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're experiencing is directly impacting our moods, our emotions. It impacts physically our endocrine, our nervous, our immune systems. So we're having both that physical and that mental reaction to the environments or the places within which we exist. We're also seeing in the research that 2/3 of people choose a natural setting to retreat to when they're stressed. In other words, finding calmness, finding peace, peace of mind in natural elements. And again, it may actually be truly outdoors, or it may just be looking at a photo of nature or out the window. We're going to talk a little later tonight about the research that a lot of physicians in that have been engaging in the healing aspects that we're finding from not only healing gardens, but even just a patient being able to look out a window and see a tree and the impact that that has on how they react to pain and how quickly they recover. So we're definitely seeing a direct connection. Now, we kind of anecdotally have known this for years, but now we're seeing the scientific research to back it up. So let me return real quick. Mark, Diane, what do we have in the chat when it comes to the question of natural examples of resilience?
Yeah, so I can jump in and start with the few folks on Facebook Live. And one person says, hiking the peak season of New England. And then another person actually looks like a poem, and I'll try my best. Leaving for peace was a glorious thing. Now seeming foolish, the birds do not sing. Though I've found a solace, it does not seem fit. The problem with nature is we squander it.
I love that. Do you have the author on who wrote that?
That would be M.L. Borello.
Yeah, I love that. That's a beautiful poem. Diane?
So I can share a few that were shared in the chat. Judith says, I remember seeing a sunflower breaking through the asphalt in downtown Nashua. And that's a great one. Julie, who must be from the West Coast, said I had to cut down a redwood I'd planted because it was intruding into our septic tank. The stump is growing dozens of new sprouts. So it's great
And
to have
nature
you
will
for
not
the
be held
rest of
back.
us. Yeah. Donna says mushrooms, and this year especially. Carol says old apple trees, and they can be amazing. Martha shares spring always follows winter, no matter how severe the winter was. Spring flowers come through the snow. And that is an amazing sight. Pamela says the surprises: a coyote crossing my path, multiple rabbits at dusk, a magnolia warbler, a pair of cedar waxwings. Beautiful image. Mary Beth shares the resilient, ever-changing shoreline.
See, and that one's very appropriate too with this book, because it's all kind of drawing on the sunrises and sunsets. So they were all beach scenes that we visited during the trip to all 50 states. And it was amazing how different the East Coast beaches versus the West Coast beaches were, and even comparing that to like the Gulf in Texas and so forth. But it's true, and that shoreline's constantly changing.
Yeah, and Julie shares a pelican with a busted off wing fought off a coyote and got away.
Oh.
Now that's a scene. And Catherine shares the 4 sugar maples in our front yard, almost 200 years old.
Ooh. Is that all of them in your chat?
That's all right now.
Yeah, those are wonderful examples in the imagery that we can see through those. You know, a few of them sparked some additional thoughts in my mind. The redwood, when we were traveling through Oregon and Northern California, we happened to hit at a time period when there was a wildfire spreading, and it was actually burning some of the redwoods. But it is fascinating when we think about the wildfires that California deals with on a regular basis, and how the green spaces continue to return, even though they have these consistent wildfires. So it does, nature has a natural resilience built into it. So here are some of the more disturbing, actually, statistics when it comes to anxiety. And we are definitely seeing in the latest research a direct impact that this past year, with dealing with COVID-19 and the disruptions that it caused in our personal lives as well as professional lives, we're seeing a rise in anxiety, especially among the young. Teenagers and college students have had the greatest spike in levels of anxiety. And so I wanted to share some of the figures with you tonight, because again, if we can, especially with our young adults, start directing them more to engaging with nature, there are some valuable lessons that they can learn from nature. I mean, even just the resilience and persistency examples that we were just sharing, but also the direct positive impact that spending time in nature tends to have on anxiety. So these are some of the latest numbers. 53% of adult Americans claimed their mental health had been negatively affected in 2020. Again, not surprising when we get a disruptor like a global pandemic. It's definitely going to spike the negative aspect of mental health. Anxiety disorders affect 40 million people in the United States. And again, this figure came from late 2020. 31.2% of Americans experience anxiety disorder at some point in their life. Compare that with 14% of people in the European Union. So the United States is seeing a higher level of anxiety disorder. 19 million Americans suffer from specific phobias. That was a bit of an increase. And again, not surprisingly, one of the areas that we saw a spike in phobias was phobias centered or focused around germs. And again, not surprising with COVID-19. 90% of people with generalized anxiety disorder have difficulty concentrating. I included this particular stat because we do have direct research now that is showing spending time out in nature, and it can be as simple as going for a walk, tends to increase the ability to focus in human beings. And they're seeing the most direct correlation with young adults. It was measuring between the ages of 14, what was the study? It went 14 to 22-year-olds. And so that's something that if we can start making that connection a little more directly with our youth, that if they're having trouble concentrating and focusing, and some of that, a lot of it actually is being driven through these anxiety disorders, that again, nature may hold some possible remedies for us. Well, let's see what I'm doing here. Sorry, I've been having a little trouble with my computer. My trackpad has jammed, and so we've switched to the old style mouse, and now it kind of has a mind of its own at times. There we go. All right, so this is a rather famous quote by Donald Miller, but I think it's one that really strikes home when we talk about things like anxiety and concentration, and especially when it hits that point when our fears rise to the point of phobias. And what Donald Miller says, all the trees are losing their leaves. This was during the fall. All the trees are losing their leaves, and not one of them is worried. And I think, again, this is a very valuable lesson, especially for our young adults, to realize that life's going to have the ups and downs, and that's actually a good thing. They're like these little reminders that we're still living. But just like the oak tree or the pine tree or the various wildlife as they struggle for their existence, just because the leaves are falling, that makes room for the new growth. And so we don't necessarily have to go directly to that point of worry and anxiety if we see the larger picture, that it's really just all part of the cycle of growth and development. So let's look at some specific aspects. We've been talking about nature in the context of resilience and persistency and possibly having this calming impact. But we do have several different ways that nature heals. And what a lot of the researchers were directly looking at, most of it, the research so far has focused on stress. That's where the overwhelming majority of the research has focused. But some of the other areas that we are seeing studies conducted, and they're coming back very positively with the correlations between time spent with nature and exposure to nature and various emotional states, is we're finding that being in nature, even just viewing natural scenes, reduces anger, reduces fear. And of course, we've been talking about stress and the way it impacts stress. There are some other physical improvements. So from a physical standpoint, we're seeing a reduction in blood pressure when people spend time in nature, reduces heart rate, muscle tension, and again, the production of stress hormones, which goes back to how important it is in offsetting stress. Healing gardens have started to gain in popularity. Some of the kind of early forerunners that were promoting the healing gardens met with some resistance, especially within our medical professions. And some of that, I would say, is largely driven by the fact that Western medicine, to a large extent, has been reactionary, historically speaking. And it's only been in relatively recent times that Western medical professionals are now looking at things proactively as well as reactively. So not just healing ailments or diagnosing, but also proactively promoting healthy lifestyles. And so we never have to deal with those actual ailments if we've promoted the healthy lifestyle on the front end. Now, healing gardens, that term, it's beginning to get a little more widespread, but initially it referred to the green spaces that were associated with healthcare facilities. So hospitals that would put a garden in, or maybe it was just a green space area with some benches. And it was aimed not only towards the patients, but also the medical staff, so the doctors, the nurses, administrative staff, and the families of the patients. And what they were finding is that the hospitals and the healthcare facilities that included green space and flower gardens, or even just trees that were visible, in particular when we're talking about patients, like through windows and such, that they tended to promote less stress. So they were seeing things like that, lowering blood pressure, lowering heart rates, but also they were seeing a greater tolerance for pain and an improvement in recovery time. And that, in fact, there's a very particular study with gallbladder patients that half of the gallbladder patients that had their gallbladders removed were positioned in beds where they could see out through a window. They could see trees and that, nature, gardens. And then the other half did not have windows in their rooms, so they couldn't actually see the natural spaces. And there was a noticeable difference in how quickly those that could see the natural spaces recovered, in contrast to those that could not. And they also seemed to complain less about the pain. And so they were drawing this correlation that having some connection with the nature was actually improving the well-being and the recovery period in the hospitals. So because of that now, we are seeing an increase in the number of health clinics that are including healing gardens. And we're even seeing private individuals putting in their own healing gardens. And a lot of hospice care is promoting healing gardens as well. Nature soothes, so helps us cope with pain and loss. This is where they have started to target funeral businesses. They're very particular with cemeteries and other places of rest, and the extent to which the green spaces are incorporated to help the family members and friends that are grieving loss. And again, we've talked about this gallbladder surgery. Interesting little side point. Robert Ehrlich, who was the one who conducted the study with the patients who had their gallbladders removed, he actually struggled throughout most of his childhood with kidney disease. And when he grew up, he actually was one of the forerunners in researching the impact that nature has when it comes to health and medical situations. Because he said as a child that he really felt that being able to see this tree when he said he was in a lot of different hospitals, some of them pretty horrendous, but he really thought about this one particular hospital he spent a lot of time in, and he could see this pine, he calls it the solitary pine tree, through his hospital window. And he said that he really felt that that pine helped him cope not only with the pain that he was going through, but with all the time that he had to spend in the hospital. And so he was one of the first researchers to start directly researching the connection between nature and patients in hospitals and under hospital care. What we are finding now is it can be as simple as having a plant in the room does have a noticeable correlation to more positive health responses. So as simple as just putting a potted plant in the room. Nature restores. 95% of people interviewed said that their mood changed from depressed, stressed, and anxious to calm and balanced after spending time outside in this particular study. This study was reported in Mind magazine. And so again, this was self-reported where they were interviewing the individuals, but they were feeling for themselves a noticeable difference just with spending some time outside. Time in nature, scenes of nature have been associated with positive mood, psychological well-being, meaningfulness. In fact, a lot of the positive psychologists that study positive psychology or happiness and the various self-reported variables for increasing happiness have now started to focus on nature as well and what impact nature has when it comes to people self-reporting of contentment with their life, feeling fulfilled, and overall vitality. Okay, spending time in nature, this I mentioned a little earlier, does help us to focus more. So this I found particularly interesting is a study that Andrea Taylor had conducted, and she's we've had it followed up with several other studies as well. In fact, there are a couple underway right now that I'm still watching their results. But what Andrea Taylor looked at is she had researched children with attention disorders and the impact that having them spend some time outdoors, whether it was on walks or even just playing outside, sometimes just allowing them to explore. The one study, they were next to like this little river, and she would just allow the children to go outside for a couple hours in the afternoon where they explored the wildlife and the plants around this river. And what they found is when the students were brought back in, they were able to focus more on the tasks that they were given, and they would be like school type tasks, than what the students who did not spend that same time outdoors were able to focus. So it's still early, but we do seem to have at least some initial research that is raising attention for children with attention disorder deficits and the impact that nature can directly have for them beneficially. Nature also we're seeing is connecting not only people to other people or individuals feeling a connection to nature itself, but to the larger world as well. And this was a very interesting study conducted by the University of Illinois in Chicago, where they looked at residents in public housing, comparing the public housing residents who had green space around the public housing versus those that did not. And it was interesting because there were a number of things that they found. The people themselves, the residents that had the green space, reported higher levels of feeling connected with their neighbors and were more concerned about helping their neighbors, which those two kind of go hand in hand. When we feel more connected to people, we tend to reach out and help more those individuals. But the other things that they found in this study that were equally surprising with just having some green space is they were looking at the crime rates. And there was a decrease in property crime around and in the Chicago public housing that had the green spaces. And then compared to the ones that did not, much higher crime rate. In other words, it seemed like the individuals had a sense of pride because they were spending time in these green spaces. And so they wanted to take care of and protect. They did not have the same levels of vandalism occurring. They also found a lower level of domestic violence in the residents in the public housing with the green spaces. So again, this is still early to kind of flush out where all these variables are falling. But what they are thinking is the lower levels of domestic violence may be resulting, tying it to other research that we know that spending time in and around nature tends to lower our levels of anger and balances our emotions more. So there may be a correlation as to why there's a lower level of domestic violence as well, if it, again, is just playing into lower levels of anger. And then to back this up with more physical evidence, they have been using the fMRI scans, which is what I have 3 images of on the screen here. But this is an MRI piece of equipment that's used to measure brain activity. And so you can see how certain parts will be lit up. And what they were finding is the parts of the brain associated with empathy, so relating to other people, caring about other people, and the portions of the brain typically associated with love were lighting up as participants viewed scenes of nature. And the parts of the brains associated with fear and anxiety tended to light up when they were shown photos or pictures of urban scenes or pictures of cities, more chaotic, busy. So they are now collecting, this has become a hot area amongst the researchers. They're now collecting more data, looking directly at the direct physical reactions of our neurons firing in the brain and what's happening as we interact different ways with nature. So interesting area to kind of follow and see where it goes. Now that's a kind of a quick Cliff Notes version of where the research is when it comes to the element of nature. Let's shift a little bit here and talk about poetry, because poetry also, we're finding, has its own ability to heal. And we're seeing positive reactions with people engaging in poetry. In fact, it's actually an activity that's being undertaken in a lot of areas with individuals to act as a release for emotions, as a calming impact. So poetry itself as a medium is positioned well to serve as a conduit between nature and positive mental health. So we can be very organized in the poetry we write, you know, whether it's the form, the meter, the rhythms, the rhyme or lack thereof that we choose to use, or it can be absolutely free flowing. And that's one of the benefits with poetry, that it just opens itself up as a medium, that there's something there for everyone. And I might be a little biased here, but I actually feel that every individual has an inner poet in them. They just need to tap into it. So with that, let me share another poem from the Sunrise Sunset collection. This one is written in the form of an English sonnet. For those that may not be familiar with what that form is, an English sonnet traditionally has 14 lines. So you'll see there are 14 lines in this poem. And those 14 lines are usually organized into what they call 3 quatrains. Those will be the first 3 paragraphs you see. Quatrain is just 4 lines in each of those. And a final rhyming couplet or 2 lines. And of course, the rhyming scheme I put up here for you, but you'll see it's basically in our quatrains every other line. So the first and third line rhyme, the second and fourth line rhyme, and then of course in your couplet at the end, it rhymes. So there's only 2 lines. The other thing you'll notice in the form here is it follows, and this is typical with English sonnets, it follows what's called iambic pentameter. It's a certain rhythm. They'll tend to be in each line 10 syllables if you count up all the syllables between the words in each line, and the syllables follow a certain pattern. It'll be an unstressed syllable followed by a stress. So like if you think of it like beating a drum, like ta-dum, 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 ta-dum. So those will be your 10 beats. Now this particular poem is one, again, I wrote this on a morning during the COVID quarantine, when we were quarantined at the cabin. And I had just read several articles the evening before that were attacking our education system, in particular higher ed. And of course, being a professor, This hits very close to home for me because although I do agree that there's a lot of room for improvement in higher ed right now. The costs of it have gotten really out of control. I think in many ways, how some of the lessons are being presented are outdated, and we may be focusing on some of the wrong disciplines. We still have a lot of the trades like welding and plumbing and that are in a way looked down upon, when in reality in our world, we would really need those trades, and they're skills that in no way should be looked down upon. So there's definitely room for improvement. But my concern as I was writing this poem is that if we truly just toss out our educational systems, or if we start to blur legitimate research, like what I've been sharing with you tonight, with kind of little quips and quotes that we see on social media, or that we see some of the research being taken out of context and shared through our news sources, that ends to basically creates a real injustice and distorts what we actually have scientific evidence to draw conclusions from. So that's kind of what was going through my mind as I wrote this particular poem called Electric Night. Hidden secrets beneath dark depths unknown, ponder and probe in search of query's edge. Tools of despair confuse and set the tone. Adherent solutions become a wedge. Golden gestures make formidable foes. Wisdom's offspring taunted by fool's deceit. Capacity dwindles, waterways close, until inquiry and reason retreat. Rigorous research blurs with mystic myth. Across the moonlit waters, tyranny creeps. Target set on academy's pith. Narcissistic nets delight as wonder sleeps. Beware when beckoned by the siren song. Shores of farce and folly will not linger long. So again, the underlying lesson that I'm hoping people gather from this when they hear it is that there's still a real value to scientific research and the staying power that actually putting together logically valid arguments has, compared to just kind of the whims and quick opinions that aren't backed up. All right, so let's toss another little chat question out there then. And again, I want to start to pull this together as we talk about nature and poetry and what we've all been experiencing with the pandemic. There have been a lot of changes, and they're still occurring now, especially with this new Delta variant. But I guess the question I would have for you all is, when you think about the changes that you've experienced during COVID-19 pandemic and perhaps are still experiencing, are there some of those changes that you would like to see continued even after the pandemic passes? And what would those be? And again, if you can throw your comments into the chat, we'll go ahead and share those out, and I'll rely again on Mark and Diane to share the Facebook feed and the chat comments.
Maria, there's one now from Julie. Less driving, more working from home, more people connecting with local nature.
You know, and it was really interesting. I agree with you, Julie. And I was fascinated even watching near my cabin the changes in wildlife patterns, which we could definitely see because people weren't out and about as much. And so I always have, like, there's one pathway that across the road from me is all woods, but there's a deer path, and a lot of like deer and bear will use that pathway. But during the months when most people were either working from home or even with children schooling from home, we started to see a lot more wildlife around. And I heard reports of that happening across the country. It's almost like the animals felt like they could come out more because we weren't encroaching so much on their space. So I agree. I kind of like a little less of the driving, the more, although I do miss being around people. I wouldn't want to be 100% remote like I was last year. There was a value to it.
Barbara shares much less desire to be constantly busy with errands and activity.
Yes, yes, I agree too. It really kind of focused in on what's important in life. And I became hyper aware of how much time I'm just moving. Like I found myself spending more time paying attention to smaller things that ended up being, now I would say, the bigger, more important things in my life, because I wasn't moving all the time.
There are a couple more. Judith shares the slower, more relaxed pace. I'm fortunate to be retired and can continue this way of life, but still be fully engaged in the projects and events I choose.
Yes. Well, and I have to add to that, like events even like this one, it's so nice how with ease now we can hop on regardless of where the speakers are, where the hosts are, that I have participated more in talks and attending as participants. In fact, one of mine, I attended a fireside chat with the CEO of Google and the CEO of Zoom. I never would have had that opportunity, except now more and more people kind of have moved into this Zoom format.
Yeah, I would have to say that's one of my silver linings as well, to be able to attend so many different presentations and webinars. It's been really wonderful for me. So Martha shares, continue hygiene practices as a way to prevent common cold and flu.
It was amazing how revolutionary washing our hands seemed to be to a lot of individuals. That was my wake-up call of how far away from just typical hygiene a lot of individuals had become or had driven.
Yeah, and playing off of that, a thoughtfulness for our community and the vulnerable folks that live in our communities. I think it's heightened that sense. What can we do to keep our community safe? So Pamela shares, continuing to set aside more time for creative endeavors, making decisions based on what's a real need and what's a want.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, it's an important one too.
Judy says, continue my weekly poetry workshops in Zoom.
I just want to say yes.
And I don't know if Mark has any coming from Facebook. That's all I see right now in the chat.
Nope, nothing from Facebook.
Okay, then we will move forward. Great, hitting on a few of the points that we're seeing with poetry. And again, this is looking at the healing power that poetry can have. We are noticing poetry when used, and most of this has been targeted specifically towards younger children, but they are starting to also collect it in a more scientific fashion with adults, is the benefit that composing poems and writing poetry can have for increasing focus as well as patience. When you think about poetry, in contrast to maybe other forms of writing, more so than a lot of the other forms of writing, although I think this is true to a certain extent with all writing, but it really seems heightened with poetry, is you have to pay attention to the meaning of words at a very deep level. Because quite often with poetry, each word, you may have a single word or a set of 3 or 4 words that are carrying the entire meaning. And it really has to convey not only that feeling that's being emitted, but poetry also can be used for exploration, to capture historically. The ancient Greeks and the Egyptians both used poetry very heavily to convey their philosophy, to convey religious beliefs, but also to capture their histories, that they captured a lot of that through poetry. So it does focus us in on really paying attention to words in a time period when texting and other maybe kind of fast ways of communicating and even confusing some of our communications have been at the forefront. Poetry has a way of slowing that back down and focusing in on the meaning of words and the importance of recognizing the meaning of words, or perhaps even in some cases having to create words to truly capture the meaning that you're trying to convey. With remembrance, again, historically, many cultures use poetry to capture their history, especially as we go into the ancient and even a lot of the early medieval periods. Sharing feelings and an outlet for emotions. Again, this research and studies that have focused on children who are like quick to frustration, have difficulty maintaining like a calmness in their emotions or understanding their emotions as they're having those. Poetry is a means to actually gain some sort of clarity, for ourselves in what it is we're feeling. And they increasingly we're seeing grief counselors resort to poetry and encouraging individuals to write poetry when they're either grieving the loss of a loved one or if they themselves have a terminal illness. A lot of times poetry will be recommended as an outlet for discovering and releasing and understanding the feelings that they're going through. And then the rhythmic patterns themselves that we see in poetry. And I absolutely love the fact that there are so many different rhythms and that poems can be very structured or very free flowing. They can rhyme, but they don't have to rhyme. That there's this flexibility, and yet poetry is really a type of written music. It has this rhythm to it. It has a certain sound to it. We read poems a certain way, and you can read a poem accenting different portions or with different melodic tones in the voice, and the poem can take on an entirely different meaning doing that. So the rhythmic patterns in a poem are extremely important. We see patterns within nature, and obviously as human beings being part of nature, we have rhythmic patterns even within our own bodies. We have rhythmic patterns in the cycle of our lives. Okay? So poetry, again, seems to be this very almost natural medium for our natural selves. And with that, I want to end with a poem that, see if I can move this out of the way a little bit. That's called Breathe. This is a poem that was really written about the global pandemic. I deliberately wrote this in 3-line stanzas where you'll notice the second and third line rhyme in each of the stanzas. And it really was rhythm that I had in mind as I was writing Breathe, because it's intended in its own rhythm to mimic our breathing patterns, and that you actually feel a breathing pattern as you read the poem. But the poem is about COVID-19. And again, thinking 10, 20 years down the road, when individuals were born after COVID passes, what it was like for those of us that lived through these days of COVID. So again, this is Breathe. Tide comes in, tide goes out, tiny boats tossed about. Shifting sands, message blurred, important warnings go unheard. Dread knocks twice, death knocks once, turning days into months. Choking gust, seagulls cries, chaos laughs as normal dies. Smiles masked, threat unseen, lives thrust into quarantine. Clouds disperse, find the way, wit and wisdom save the bay. Serenity sought, hope regained, sun rises once more, unconstrained. And again, we see that final theme of resilience coming in once again. So I would like to kind of turn this over, open this up in a more open discussion format for our remaining time. It looks like we have, what, about 25 minutes left. If we can just kind of have more of an open discussion about the ways that you see poetry being a conduit or a useful medium to connect people with nature, in particular to encourage positive mental states and peace of mind during this COVID-19 that we're all dealing with right now. We can probably do this, Mark. You think maybe just have people raise their hand and then we can unmute them and let us share their views?
So at the bottom of your screen, you should have a raise hand button, and that'll pop you up to the top of my list. And I have these buttons that allow folks to unmute. So feel free, if you are interested in reflecting on this question with us, to raise your hand.
Any brave souls?
Not yet. Okay, I see you there, Judy. How does this work?
Hey, can you hear me now?
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I'd have to run and get my book, one of my poetry books, but I was trying to remember there was a series of poems that were written by this person that was always like advice from, have you heard of that? Like advice from the river.
Oh, I haven't heard that, but it sounds really interesting.
Advice from a tree. And he and his daughter, you know, had continued with that. And so in our poetry group, we had a topic then based on that. Can we do our poems, you know, advice from some piece of nature? It was very interesting to do, and I enjoy reading his poems too. And, you know, he has commercialized it a bit with like, I guess you could call them like bookmarks and things like that.
I think I have seen those on bookmarks.
Yeah, or magnets, you know, different things.
Who is the author on that? You said it was father-daughter?
Yes. Advice from, now he was doing it himself. And then he joined with his daughter on it. And it was called One Type of Business. And then they changed the name of it a little bit.
Yeah, I'll have to definitely check that out.
Yeah, you don't have to Google advice from a tree, advice from a river, something like that. But I really like the way, you know, he thought that out with his words and everything. It's like you could pretend you were the river and got some advice.
Sorry, I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see our participants and all that better. There we go. So do we have anyone else that has either some favorite poetry or a favorite poem or an approach maybe that poetry has either helped you in the past or that you think could maybe help? Again, as a college professor, I'm always focused on our young adults, that as they're kind of finding their individuality and their way in life, do you see ways that nature and or poetry could assist in that? I think Catherine O'Brien has her hand up.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
I just wanted to mention one poet, Mark Doty, who has written some poems that describe aspects of nature in such detail with such close observation. So he has a poem called, I think, A Green Crab Shell, and it completely makes you alert to every aspect of that. It's almost like a painting in words. And just wanted to mention that his poetry is well worth reading.
Well, and thank you for sharing that, because that is an area where in our very fast-paced and kind of busy, sometimes somewhat chaotic society, to be able to slow down enough to observe in that kind of detail, I think it's extremely important that we have models for how to do that. And it sounds like that's what Mark's capturing in his poetry. So I'll definitely look up A Green Crab Shell and read some of his. Pamela?
Yes, I just have to share that Mary Oliver is my go-to poet when I'm, really needing some soothing and, want to read poems about nature. And if groups were pulled together with, younger people or adolescents, to read Mary Oliver's poems, because she's, I think, the rare poet who is absolutely brilliant, but also accessible.
And that's tough. That's a tough mix. That I agree. She's one of my favorite. I like her a lot. But I do think that's a very difficult combination to find. Is quite often the brilliance tends to talk over a lot of people's heads in that. So to be able to bring that back down and make it very accessible, I think is its own type of genius, to be honest with you. So that's part of the reason I like her as well.
If I could interject, I don't read a lot of poetry, I must confess. But I do facilitate some nature-based, kind of place-based education in a past life. And one of the poems that I relied on as a facilitation tool is a poem called Lost by David Wagner. If folks have ever heard of that. I pulled it up and it's pretty short if you want me to read it.
Yeah, go ahead and share it.
So Lost. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen. It answers, I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again saying here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. And that was really meaningful to us because I was facilitating backpacking experiences in New Mexico with people that didn't know each other from all over the country. And we came together to learn about the nature of New Mexico. And then we would go back and we would never see each other again. And we use that as like a tool to say, hey, we built memories and connections here. And you can come back to this place, whether you're here physically or just in your mind.
Oh, I love that. Well, and it's interesting too for the individual who may actually feel lost in the woods, that I think it has a message there as well, that the trees aren't lost.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's really just avoiding panicking and getting your bearings again. So do we have anyone else that would like to share? And I will also, if anyone has a favorite poem or that, but doesn't necessarily want to read it out or share it, feel free to put it in the chat. We can capture that and share with the participants here after the session as well. I'm not sure if, oh, that answered my question. I was just asking if Judy's hand was back up.
It's back up.
It's back up. Okay.
I don't know. We'll see. Do I have to unmute myself again?
I can hear you, so you're unmuted.
Well, anyway, that advice from a river and all that stuff. I found the source of that. It's the HTTPS, :// then it says myadviceforlife.com.
And that's 4 with FOR or the number 4?
FOR.
Okay.
And there is a Your True Nature documentary. It's a 3-minute, 6-second, and that is on YouTube.
Nice.
I think that talks more about, the person that started it up.
So I've captured both of those.
I do have a short poem actually that, it's like an inspiration from that website. If you wanted to hear it.
We have time. We've got about 10 minutes left, so go ahead.
Oh, I'll talk fast. Okay. Advice from a river. May your life stream keep flowing, meander through smooth passages and through bumpy ones. Plan ahead for rocky times. There will be calm waters ahead. Be a solution for those who thirst. Move along the current in life. Enjoy your trip all along the way. Value where you came from, your source.
Yeah, that is poignant.
But I really like his selections.
Yeah, I love that approach.
It's different.
It looks like we do have some additions in chat. Let's see, long history of writing about and in nature and haiku poetry, often reflecting changing seasons. And then the Pawns from Mary Oliver's House of Light collection is being recommended. Oh, and of course, Wendell Berry.
Mhm.
Yeah. This is one of the few times I've talked about place that Wendell Berry didn't appear. He's in almost all my talks.
Yeah, and I wonder what this group thinks about other authors that aren't, I don't know, they're not really poets. Like when I think of Aldo Leopold, it's like ecologist, but there is a certain poetry to his writing, and Rachel Carson the same way.
Mm-hmm.
Very,
Well, they are definitely the forefathers and mothers of this whole kind of writing about nature and so forth, that they put a spotlight on it for many people. The Oven Bird by Robert Frost. Yeah, that's another good one. Okay, well, it appears that people may have been talked out and shared what they have to share. I don't want to waste people's time tonight. I really do appreciate everyone showing up. And Mark, I believe we have another poet coming up in our talks.
yeah, we sure do. So yeah, thank you all for joining us and your interest in this Exploring Connection series, which is again hosted by us, New Hampshire Audubon, and supported by the New Hampshire Humanities Council. I'm going to put a few links in the chat. One of them being a feedback survey, which is really helpful in communicating the importance of these talks to our funder. And yeah, the next talk will be on September 7th, and we'll kind of go in a more quick pattern of talks about once a week or once every 2 weeks. And so all of those can be on the same, registered for on the same page that you registered for this talk. So thank you, Maria, for presenting this evening. Thank you, Diane, for organizing this series. And thank you all for tuning in and learning alongside us. We look forward to seeing you again in the near future.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great night.